Hi, welcome to Bookmark. I'm your host, Don Noble. Today's guest is Dr. Trudier Harris, winner of the 2018 Clarence Kaysen Award for Distinguished Work in Narrative Nonfiction. Harris is the author of many studies of African American literature and Summer Snow, a memoir of her childhood in Tuscaloosa's West End. Trudier, it's nice to see you again. The last time that we were in the same room, you were receiving the Clarence Kaysen Award for 2018 for distinguished work in narrative nonfiction. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. It's quite an honor.
That is an honor which I can honestly envy. And the thing I envy about it the most, not just the quality, I mean, your work is superb, but you look at the list of people who have won it, and you just think, oh, what a nice list to be on.
As a friend of mine says, to read something like that is an experience in humility.
It's amazing. We've been giving it for 23 years or something, and we have 6 Pulitzer winners. Mm-hmm. And they are all of those people on that list are Alabama writers.
Yes.
Defensively, authentically
Yes.
Alabama writers. Even the ones who don't look like it are. They were raised here, went to school here, worked here. We can claim an extraordinary number of nonfiction writers.
Well, I am just absolutely delighted to be a part of that group, and my family is delighted. Everybody I know has been so congratulatory, so
wonderful.
I'm really happy about it all.
And there can't be a more authentic Alabamian than you. I mean, you were born and raised here. I want to talk about your memoir, but I want to do it a little bit later in our conversation.
That's fine.
When we get to Summer Snow, the memoir. You were raised in Tuscaloosa's West End.
Yes.
And that is mainly the subject of Summer Snow.
Yes.
But you did go to Stillman College. Now, you were planning on going somewhere else, perhaps, and then you didn't?
Yes, I was planning to go to Knoxville College in Tennessee. One of my teachers had moved to Knoxville, and I was hoping that I could go to Knoxville, stay with her while I was in college. But unfortunately, she was not able to accommodate me. So I ended up, because I was very familiar with Stillman, I ended up at Stillman College. And that turned out to be a good experience overall.
Stillman is that an old Methodist school?
Presbyterian school.
Presbyterians,
yes.
My wife taught there briefly, and I would go there every day to take her there and bring her back. And it was filled with people from Nebraska. Was that true? They had made
Nebraska.
They had made a connection
Yes.
with Nebraska.
That is really interesting because the woman for whom I worked my first couple years at Stillman, Lois Brody, was from Nebraska.
Uh-huh.
Now you've told me something that I wasn't really aware of before.
These are exchange students, and a number of Stillman students had gone and whether it was the University of Nebraska, I'm not quite sure,
Mm-hmm.
but a number of Nebraskans had come and lived in the West End in Tuscaloosa for a while.
And the president at Stillman College at that time was from Nebraska as well. Not only Nebraska, but we also had a connection to Indiana University.
Did you?
And we had professors come down the summer and teach, and the regular sessions as well. I remember taking an American literature class from a professor from Indiana University. And then during the summer between my junior and senior years at Stillman, I was actually able to go and attend classes at Indiana University.
Did you?
And thought I was going to go there for graduate school. But they were slow about getting a fellowship offer out to me. Yeah. And in the meantime, Ohio State had gotten one ahead of them.
And we're talking about Bloomington.
Yes.
Yeah.
Bloomington, Indiana. Right.
Well, writers usually don't love it if I ask them about famous people they knew. But your biography includes the tiny fact that you worked as a student assistant for a while to Condoleezza Rice's father.
I did.
He was there only a year or two.
He was there briefly. He was dean of students.
Yeah.
And then he got a job, I think it was in Colorado, because later they ended up in California, in the Stanford area, where she would join the faculty as a professor of political science later on. But yes, he was there briefly, and I happened to be his student assistant, yes.
Well, I read her memoir, and I I knew a lot about her as a Secretary of State and what have you. I had no idea I didn't know that she'd even passed through Stillman, especially that her father had been an administrator there. That is an interesting, well, tangent at least.
Yes, and you probably know that she was a very precocious musician at a very, very early age and all that. But not only was I her father's student assistant at Stillman, but later when I had a fellowship to the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences at Stanford, I actually rented Condoleezza Rice's apartment while she was in D.C. with the Reagan administration.
Well, you lived in the provost's apartment?
I lived in the provost's apartment.
Well, good
and
for
not
you.
only did I live in the provost's apartment, but I was able to renew my acquaintance with her father because he had moved out to California at that point.
How nice.
So we were able to share a couple of meals during the time I was out there.
Well, that's just extraordinary. You chose then to go to Ohio State,
Yes.
as they say, I guess they is you in this case, the
Ohio
State University.
Right.
I never quite understood that, but okay. Finished there, got your PhD there.
Yes.
And looking at your life story, that's a fork in the road right there. Finishing the PhD at Ohio State is a moment for you.
Mm-hmm.
You had all the credentials. You'd been a diligent student, and you could have chosen a lot of places to go work, but you chose to return to, in this case, Virginia, but as a state in the Confederacy. Why
Right.
did you choose to return to the South when you could have gone to Seattle or Maine or Boston?
Or Massachusetts.
Yes.
That was the other
Right.
choice, Massachusetts. And I always say that I accept jobs, make job decisions based on weather. And I'm interested in things that are
People do,
east
really.
of the Mississippi, south of the Mason-Dixon line.
Right.
As it turned out, I had an interview with the University of Massachusetts at Amherst.
Right.
And a young man whom I came to know very well later had an interview with William and Mary. I was offered the job at Massachusetts, and he was offered the job at William and Mary. He didn't go to Mass, and I didn't go to William and Mary. We traded out. So I ended up coming back to the South, yes, William and Mary, Williamsburg, Virginia, which was a decision that I made sort of unknowingly in some way. Certainly the weather part of it was there, but I had no idea what it would be like to be in Williamsburg, Virginia in terms of its social isolation at that point. Very good school, excellent students, great colleagues. I was very warmly welcomed, but I was 100% of the African American faculty at the College of William and Mary.
You were first and one, first and only.
Yes.
But you were there 7 or 8 years.
I
weren't
was
you?
there for 6 years. I was there long enough to get tenure. And then I gave up tenure to go to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill.
Well, that 6-year stretch and earning tenure and being the first African American male or female
Yes.
professor,
Yes.
they just honored you last year
Yes.
at William and Mary.
They were celebrating, or I should say are, because the year is going on. This academic year, they're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Black student presence at the College of William and Mary. So last September, I was invited up to be recognized as the first tenured African American faculty person. And I delivered the Jess and Sarah Cloud distinguished lecture while I was there. Yeah.
William and Mary is they've been in the news a good deal. They've been on television a good deal lately. And it seems to me that in 2018, if not in 1968, it is an amazingly diverse school now.
Yes.
It's not the same place you were at all.
No, not at all. And in fact, it became diverse pretty quickly after I left. Within, I would say, 5 or 6 years, there were 4 African Americans in the English department there. I don't know about other departments, but certainly the student body continued to increase as well. And this year, as you may have read in the Chronicle of Higher Education or seen on the news, they have their first female president ever.
I did not know that.
At the College of William and Mary. Her last name is Rowe. I think the first name is Catherine, but this is the first female president.
But when the Tar Heels called, you and I share wonderful, warm experiences at Chapel Hill.
Yes.
I spent 4 of the happiest years of my life on Franklin Street,
Yes.
walking around between one shop and one coffee shop, the Carolina Coffee Shop, the Carolina Inn,
the Rathskeller.
Rathskeller.
Yeah.
That
Landmarks.
I was speaking just this weekend with a young woman who's living there, and she says, alas, it doesn't look the same at all, that it's really, really built up. But it was a little paradise in the old days.
I was there about 3 weeks ago, and it is amazing the number of high-rise buildings that are dominating the skyline on Franklin Street and Rosemary Street. So it is different.
That's the trouble with a really good place, is that you can't keep people out.
People discover it, and they want to come.
They want to go there.
And so they change it. The campus, however, I think is still one of the most beautiful campuses in the country.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You write, and you don't dwell on this. You do not harp on this. But I read it, and it kind of startled me. There are little passages in your memoir about colleagues, maybe at William and Mary, but not identified by name. Absolutely not, and not identified by name at Chapel Hill either. But was there a certain amount of resentment or resistance or quiet racism among your, not among some 18-year-old boy, but among colleagues, other people on the faculty?
I think occasionally that might have been the case, but sometimes it was hard to tell if
Yeah.
it were a matter of race or if it were a matter of gender.
Oh.
For example, at William and Mary, we had maybe 31, 32 people in the English department when I was there. Only 4 of us were female, and 1 African American. So it might have been that as well.
Yeah.
But when somebody says to you, because you make get excellent ratings in teaching, you better stop making all those good ratings or getting those good ratings, or we're going to break both your legs.
It doesn't sound like an English professor
No,
to me.
it doesn't sound like an English professor, so you're not quite sure what's happening there. Or when a colleague at Chapel Hill says, when you're in a meeting and you're just asking questions, like anybody would ask questions, and the person says, "Why do you always go for the balls?" And you're saying, "What? I just ask a question." So in that instance, I was dealing with some kind of stereotype of the strong, loud, aggressive black woman kind of thing.
Well, Chapel Hill had integrated by gender very slowly, and not much before you were there.
Yeah, women just arrived at 1960s?
Yes.
Yeah, because they used to go to college down in Greensboro.
Right. I was there from 65 to 69, and there were a good many undergraduate women and graduate students, and my colleagues as a graduate student were probably 40% women. But
Yes.
I sensed there were very few black students in the graduate program in English,
Yes.
as I remember it. But I do remember conversations among some of my older professors about what a waste of time it was to educate women to get a PhD when they were just going to get married and have children.
I remember grad students expressing those sentiments when I was there, things that had been expressed to them. So yes, there might have been some of that. With the expectation that you're wasting your time either as a woman getting a degree or just as a scholar generally getting a degree in or wanting to specialize in African American literature.
Oh.
I remember so vividly one of my older colleagues saying to a student who wanted to take a course in African American literature, "Oh, you don't need to do that. That's just like reading magazines. You can go out and read that on your own."
If anybody thinks that Invisible Man is like reading a magazine, they're reading a lot more difficult magazines than I'm reading.
Well, and just wrong-headed people. Or when I had a colleague who wanted to study one of Toni Morrison's novels and wanted to write about it, and I said, "Well, perhaps you might consider getting some context, read some more Toni Morrison, and read some more other African American writers." And the person said, "I don't need to do that. I can say whatever I want to say."
You know, you surprised me. This is not a court of law. I do ask questions to which I do not already know the answer. But I am surprised by this. a certain amount, I remember a certain amount of racial prejudice at Chapel Hill, or in the town and in the university. And I remember a certain amount of gender prejudice. But my recollection is different from yours. I think in those days, African American literature was terra incognita, but it was not understood to be simple. It was just unknown. I mean,
But that was one expression, one person's expression.
Right.
And you also have to consider that just before I arrived there, Blyden Jackson had come.
I knew him.
The professor from Southern University. And that was in a pattern throughout the country where a lot of predominantly white universities were bringing in African American professors.
Right.
So the combination of Blyden Jackson and Louis Rubin working together to bring about some change in that department in terms of African American literature, and getting, as Joe Flores said to me recently, younger scholars like J. Lee Green or Thaddeus Davis or myself in the to the department to watch that program grow and to usher in its growth. Then there were some changes.
I remember Blyden Jackson and Lewis.
Yeah.
And Louis Leary, who had been, Blyden Jackson had been brought in at 65 from Southern. Louis Leary had been brought in at 65 from Columbia.
Yeah.
And they all had cards made. I don't know if these cards were still on their doors, but it was the Southern Literary Mafia. And the three doors of those three professors had those titles on them. And I knew what was happening because they were having fun.
Yeah.
But a lot of the students would walk up to
Puzzled.
this, they, what, not an Italian in the bunch, mind you, but the three of them had these cards, and the people just thought that was wonderful. Do you think now, I mean, now it's another few decades, I'm sorry to say, have passed, but is African American literature still understudied?
It is still understudied. Not by a lot of folks. I think there's still, when students go on the job market, I'm told this year there were more job openings in African American literature than there have been for a while. But when students go on the job market, people want that specialty area.
Yeah.
On the other hand, I see some reduction in numbers. Like when I was at Chapel Hill, there were 5 of us who could do African American literature. Look at their faculty now, and I think they're down to like 2. And when you think about the numbers of people who are actually getting engaged and involved in this, maybe those numbers are not as robust as they were at one point.
I think numbers of English majors may not be as robust as they were at one point. I mean, it's people still don't quite understand that the English major prepares you for a whole lot of different occupations, but nevertheless, as often as we tell them, it doesn't stick.
But I think one thing that's happened with the study of African American literature is that if there are slight retrenchments on American soil, it's just blossoming throughout the world. So there are conferences, for example, in France, focused exclusively on African American literature. There are organizations in Europe founded specifically to study African American literature and culture. And in fact, I went to 2 of those last year, 2017. One is the Collegium on African American Research, which was founded, I think, in Germany with some collaborators from Spain. But we met in Spain last June. And I met Spain the year before for a conference, a small conference that focused on autobiography. And Southern African American autobiography was a part of that.
Autobiography used to be the mainstream of study. It was the fugitive slave narratives and the memoir autobiographies that came after it.
Right.
One thing I have noticed in your work, you have anthologies and you have collections of a volume of essays about James Baldwin, a volume of essays about Toni Morrison, and so on. But in your last 2 collections, you've written about a lot of African American writers that I think I don't know who that is, and it's good. I think that's particularly useful and valuable work because you're bringing some attention to people whose names are not Toni Morrison and James Baldwin.
Well, one of my colleagues teases me and says, "Do you plan to write about every African American writer?"
Yes.
Not quite, but you're right. Somebody like William Melvin Kelly. That is not a writer whose name is very well known. Right. Raymond Andrews, who wrote several novels about Creative County near Athens, Georgia, Muscogean County, he calls it. Those writers aren't known. So one of the things that I keep doing is introducing people to more African American writers.
And the only measurement for this is you read this person and you think, people should know about this.
Exactly.
That's the only measurement.
Yeah.
If you want people to know about it, get it out there.
And on Thursday, I'm driving over to Atlanta to participate in Revival, Lost Southern Voices. I don't
Right.
know if that's a conference you're familiar with, but every year they focus on centering or reclaiming writers who are not so well known. And
Right.
this, I'm going to
Sure.
focus on Dolores Phillips,
Right.
who did the novel The Darkest Child that was published in 2004.
This kind of thing, it occasionally I'm a skeptic. I think people are being rediscovered who might very well be
That's
left
true.
unknown. But I actually remember, and you will too, when Louis Leary discovered Kate Chopin, The Awakening. She'd been gone for a century, and he put out this paperback of The Awakening with an introduction, and everybody said, holy cow, that's
Exactly.
really good.
Exactly. When you consider all of Zora Neale Hurston's works were out of print.
That's right. Right.
By the 1970s. And when you consider that the work that Alice Walker did, Robert Hemingway did in his biography of her to
Right.
try to reclaim Zora Neale Hurston, and Alice Walker saying specifically that with these writers, we need to reclaim them, we need to dig them up, bring them back if we have to do it bone by bone.
And I think the test for this stuff, I mean, you and I have been in this business a long time.
Yeah.
The test, you can get out your spotlight and you can shine it on a forgotten writer. But if that stuff's not actually good, it won't last. If
That's
people
true.
people will look at it and they'll say, "Well, that was very nice of you to dig up those bones, but I don't care for those bones."
Yeah.
And they'll recede into the dark again. But the ones that are worthy, the ones you bring attention to, and everybody says, "Wow, look at that! That's wonderful."
They will stay there, and we're hoping that with Phillips's The Darkest Child that will be the case.
Well,
Somebody like Alice Childress. I was just talking about her in class yesterday. It's not so much lost; it's just not focused on. But now she's been. There are some of us who are really thinking and writing about her, so that's good.
the subject, you have more books than anyone can carry. Yeah. Books you've written, books you've edited, books you've been in, books you've done with in collaboration with other people. But the book of the moment is Summer Snow, because it's your memoir. It's
Right.
your memoir of growing up in the West End of Tuscaloosa. And the single incident that most readers will remember is when the white boy in the car propositions you, asks you if you'll go on a date or be naughty
Would you go out with a white boy for $5?
for $5.
Yeah,
How old were you?
I was 12.
12. How old was he? He must have been at least 16.
Well, it was hard to tell because he was driving. You can conclude that he's.
Yeah,
but this is
yeah.
the South. I mean, people get behind the wheels of cars before that. But he was certainly old enough to drive and old enough to scare the living daylights out of me
Yeah.
with his driving by and asking that question.
Young idiot. That startled. The first time I read Summer Snow now a couple of times, but the first time I thought, oh my. And the other thing that there's a lot in there about your family, your earliest childhood in Greene County, in
Yes.
the country, and your father and your mother and your siblings. You go pretty light on the civil rights movement in Tuscaloosa. There are other studies of that too.
Right.
But the thing that interested me, my younger daughter, I drove her every morning to what had been Druid High.
Yes.
Every morning for years after integration. And your chapters on integration of the school system, I found those most fascinating. Everyone assumes that this is an absolute plus, that everything gets better because we've changed in these directions. And your remarks about that, some of the teachers weren't as good, the administrators weren't as good, the education wasn't as good.
Yeah. The control in the classroom was lost.
Right.
The teacher-parent connection
Yeah.
that was so strong as I was growing up was lost. And you think back to Zora Neale Hurston in the 1950s when
right.
she opposed the Brown versus Board of Education decision. She says, what? Integrate our schools? What does this mean? What you're saying is you're insulting black teachers because black teachers care, they're there, they can do the job. Let them do their job instead of bringing in these people who would just babysit our kids.
And students of Hurston, readers of Hurston, especially their eyes were watching God. You think she was made by that all-black community.
Exactly.
In which the mayor was black and the policeman was black and the store owner was black and there was opportunity for leadership roles and cooperation and everything, and a lot of that was lost.
A lot of that was lost, and I think people misread Hurston's position and that she's gotten a bad deal in terms of her rejecting or opposing that decision.
Yeah, she was not a racist or a
No,
segregationist.
she was not. She was
just
a
didn't-
firm lover of African American people and African American culture.
She did not want to lose what had been
What
had been gained.
What defined her?
I have one question more, and we're really out of time. When I finished Summer Snow, I thought, there's a lot of life story left here. Are you going to do a second volume of memoir?
I'm not sure that I'm going to do a second volume that I specifically call a memoir. I do have a second volume of essays, personal essays, that's more topical. It's called Unspeakable Difficult Times and Difficult Topics. But I don't know if I'll get back to another Summer Snow, but I may.
I hope you do. Actually, if you go ahead with that, and now I will read it, and we will sit down here and talk about it.
Thank you so much.
Trudier, thank you. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you.